So hello everyone, thank you for joining us. So the objective of today's session is to help you explore financial modeling across various domains. So that is why we have some very experienced panel members from different domains. So I'll start with introducing each one of them, and then I'll also set the objective or I'll set you the tone of what today's session is going to be. So first, let me introduce Jinal Shah. So Jinal is a chartered accountant and also has extensive experience working on the actual side of things. So she's cleared 13 papers in actuarial science. So she just needs to complete 2 more papers to become a fellow actuary. And she's also a ST1 topper in actuarial science and has worked extensively in the same domain. She's worked earlier with Kotak, then with HDFC Life as actuarial analyst. She's also worked extensively on the consulting side of actuarial science. And being a chartered accountant and somebody on the actuarial science, she probably knows finance as well as actuarial science a lot. So she'll help us take us through in terms of understanding financial modeling on the actuarial domain. Then we have Shashank. Shashank is Vice President at Swiss Re. He is taking care of quantitative risk management. He has done BTech from IIT and he has over 12 years of experience, majorly on quantitative risk management side. So he'll be helping us understand in terms of what is this quantitative modeling all about, what kind of skill sets are required, what people expect in that. We also have Venkat with us. Venkat is a CFA charter holder. He's also completed CIPM. He also has around 12 years of experience. He's currently working with CRISIL on the business development side. He's worked extensively on portfolio management. So he'll be able to help us in terms of understanding what modeling means from a portfolio management side of things, right? A lot of time in portfolio management, we learn formulas, but how do you use financial models in portfolio management? He'll help us understand this. And finally, about myself. So I'm Vishwanath. I'm also a chartered accountant with around 16 years of experience. I've worked extensively on modeling, mainly from equity research side and corporate budgeting and financial planning. That is the side I have worked extensively on. So I'll be able to take you through in terms of what does financial modeling mean in these arenas. Now, when you talk about setting the agenda for today's session, what I would like to do is I'll first take you through what is the objective of today's session. The objective of today's session is to help all our participants understand what is financial modeling and also how it's applied in different domains, what kind of skill sets people require to give you a much bigger picture. So, because when you look at financial modeling, if you try to Google, you would see somebody from investment banking side talking about what does financial modeling means to them. Forecasting income statement, doing valuations, right? But here, as you can see, we have members from different domains. So they'll all be able to help us in terms of understanding the big picture about what is financial modeling. So that is what our objective today is. I will initially take you through some basic fundamentals about what at Profectus Academy, when I talk to people about financial modeling, what do we talk about that? I'll take you through that. Then we'll also have our panel members share their thoughts of what matters in financial modeling. And finally, in the meanwhile, any questions that you have, right? The main objective today is, in addition to our agenda, anything that you would like to ask, any clarification, be it in terms of knowing what skill sets to learn or in terms of what areas to focus on or anything specific. I mean, it's all under the sun about financial modeling. Anything that you have, feel free to ask us. That's why it's called as all about financial modeling. So feel free to ask us. Only thing is, case specific technical questions, we won't be able to address it here because obviously those things will divert our entire topic elsewhere. So if you want to say, how I had a particular problem in a particular financial model, what formula I could have used, those kind of questions, obviously we can't take it here. But any other questions, feel free to ask. We have, in fact, we had one person joining us from a machine learning side of things as well. Unfortunately, he couldn't join us in the last moment. Otherwise, we would have probably had all the skills required for financial modeling we would have had under the sun here. So we already have almost everyone. So I will start with a very quickly. I'll share my screen and take you through a few slides to talk about what is financial modeling as we see things, and then I will, as I said, I'll let our panel members also talk to us about across other domains. So when you talk about financial models, I actually like to always look at this particular elephant as a, to tell what is a financial model, because financial model, I say, it's always like this big elephant, and everyone is like this one of those five blind men who try to figure out what is this big elephant all about. Everybody, based on their exposure, comes up with their own definition. So when you talk about financial model, the first thing I say is, before you go into financial model, think of what is a model. When you talk about a model, if you go to a builder, they will probably show you a model apartment, which is a very miniature version of a society, right? Or you talk about, you go to something like a apparel store, and you will have a mannequin there, which is also a model with all the dressed up mannequins. So we have models in many contexts. So what is common about all of them? If you think of it, these models try to explain how something could look in real life. So the builder is showing you the miniature apartment or the miniature society overview, because you don't know it's under construction. The society is under construction. You can't visualize what would it look once it's done. So they are helping you visualize. Similarly, a mannequin is trying to show you how a particular design would fit on a real person, right? Because if it's on the shelf all folded up, or if it's on a hanger, you wouldn't probably be able to understand it. But when there's a mannequin, it tells you how it would look like. So same way, if you look at financial models, the idea of a financial model is to help you understand how a particular phenomenon would look like. Only thing is, unlike this building or this mannequin, which can be physically shown, in financial modeling, we try to show things that are not easy to physically visualize. So, for example, if I want to ask a question in terms of how would a business look like 10 years from today, obviously I can physically show you a business 10 years from today. So we try to show them through numbers. So these come under a big category called as mathematical modeling. So financial modeling is one area under this mathematical model. You can use mathematical model in physics. You can use them in so many domains. In finance, when you use it, we call them as financial models, right? So you can, why do we build these models? Again, main idea is to kind of get a sense of decision making. So for example, if I want to start a taxi business, let's say, I want to come up with maybe a competition to Ola. Now, question is, how do I know whether this business would be successful or not? One way to do it is, try and see. Start at a small scale, try and see whether things could work out. The problem is, when you try and do it short run, there could be certain questions. What if petrol prices suddenly increase, or what if petrol prices drop, or what if people start working from home and number of people traveling comes down? What if metro penetration increases? Again, people taking taxi comes down. You need to answer these kind of questions. By doing a pilot testing, you can't answer them, because in a pilot testing, you are answering question under the current environment, right? You are not talking about uncertain future. Whereas a financial model will help you answer all these questions. Now, when we talk about financial model, what all are there in a financial model? I would say, a financial model contains four components to it. One is the model. What is the model? Model is basically, that's an equation that tells you how certain one variable affects another variable. How can, let's say, income affect your expenses, or how can income affect your savings? How can interest rate affect NPAs in a bank? What is the relationship between interest rates and NPAs? What is the relationship between, let's say, mortality and insurance premium, right? The relationship that we bring in is what we call as a model. Now, this relationship that you derive has to be backed by data. So sometimes if you're thinking that, okay, what interest rate could affect my NPAs in a particular way, you want to study this. How does it happen? That is where the data comes in. So as a good modeler, we also need to have skill sets to work on the data side of things, clean the data, study the data, do statistical analysis on the data. So those are other aspects that you need to have. That's another skill set that you need to have. The third aspect is the code. What we mean by code is, when you're developing models, it's basically a set of equations, right? Now you can't keep solving. You can solve all the equations manually, but it's going to take you a long time. If you have to solve a very complex problem, it will take you a long time if you're going to solve it with pen and paper and calculator. And also, when every time something changes, it'll again take you all that much time to kind of redo everything. So when you're by coding, I'm talking about software. It could be Excel, it could be Python, it could be SQL, anything. It's about developing a proper code that can run this model automatically and in a very efficient manner. And final skill set that a modeler may need to have is estimation skills. What I mean by that is, let's say I have figured out that my income, my savings will be 20% of my income. Now, if I have to estimate my savings, now first question is what is my income? I have to estimate that. Or if I'm going to say rise in interest rate will result in NPA going up, or 1% increase in interest rate will affect our NPA going up by 0.5%. Now the next question is, so how much will the interest rate go up? Because only then I can finally conclude what would be the impact of that on my NPAs in a bank. So this is the four separate components of financial models, the way I put it. Now here is where I would like to bring our expert panel members in, because when you talk about these models, these data, these coding, the level to which somebody spends time on the model or the data or the code depends on domain to domain, right? So I'll first start from my end. If you talk about modeling in a financial forecasting, it involves lots of qualitative stuff. Because if I want to look at, how does increase in income affect my employee cost? How does it affect my salary? Sometimes it could be about my judgment. I am not looking at statistics. I'm going based on my judgment. It's purely my judgment, and based on the judgment, I may say, oh no, okay, employee cost will affect or will not affect, or rather growth in sales will affect or will not affect employee cost. We rely a lot on judgments, especially if we think of modeling for somebody like us, startups, right? It's a whole story. We just create the story on the Excel file, right? But I would like to know, probably Gina, you could talk about things. How do you think in actuarial side of things, how much do you think in terms of models they rely on story? How much do you think they rely largely on numbers and data, historical data? What are your thoughts?
So as far as the actuarial side of the part is concerned, a lot of data crunching. In fact, what we use models for pricing as well as in valuation, plus whatever numbers we get from valuation, saying that when you do valuation of a company, you also reporting for the company, you're also finding what are the reserves that you have to put, and when you're doing that, you actually have over here, when you said about data modeling, code and estimate, one of the most important part, which I feel is going to be a part of the data itself, is going to be assumptions in case of actuarial models, especially with life. And these assumptions are always tested against actuals, and that's what we would do a lot, even in our CA profile or risk profile, which Shashank would be probably handling. But whenever you have these are your assumptions, then you will keep on tracking those assumptions, check it whether really that is what is taking place, a year on year, a quarterly, a monthly, and then you will feed into that data saying that, look, you had assumed the interest rate to be this, that is why this is the difference, but now since last 3 years, 5 years, this is how it is going to be like. Or we because we are in the insurance and life insurance, we rely more on the bond yields. So what looks like a long term bond yields, that will again feed into the data. The relationships, as we said, variables are the relationship between the interest rate, and if the interest rate goes high, will they be able to pay premiums, or what would be the surrender rates? Because obviously the opportunity cost of then paying premiums will change, right? If you don't have, like, a lockdown took place and people didn't have money, and life insurance premium will be something not on so much priority list, so then it would again feed in and say that, okay, there needs to be a change in data, as well as how the relationship, because the dynamics will change. What we had assumed, like A will impact B, and that's how C will take place, but then the real data would come in, that you would feed in again in your model and see how the revised and for us, at least in pricing models, we would always have best estimate, pessimistic estimate, and the optimistic estimate to see. Obviously, the premiums are on the best estimate, but we would always have to report to all the, even the statutory authorities on what you think, how your profit is going to be. And so a lot of use of simple models, relationships, and how we use to, derive our profitability, cash flows, premium rates, surrender values, benefits.
Oh, thank you, Gina. Shashank, if you could share your thoughts in terms of how you use models, and I mean quantitative models especially. These are four that the way I see the models. When I break the models, I break it into data, model, code, and estimates. How do you see the models in terms of your components in quantitative? What is your area of focus largely?
Yeah. So like you mentioned, I'm quantitative risk manager. So my area of focus is sort of model validation. So there are a lot of models in our company which are used for decision making. Some are actuarial models, some are models related to capital markets. And I'll broadly segregate, classify them in three different categories. One are sort of your pricing models. So how do you price a financial product? So probably you would have heard about things like CAPM, APT, or Black-Scholes model. So these are the things which you use to price things. So what is the discount rate that you should use, or what is sort of one? How do you apply law of one price to value European options? So these are sort of one broad category, pricing or valuation models. Other broad category will be sensitivity models. So like you mentioned, the forecast can change depending upon how the future evolves. So if you sort of take inputs and shock them by small factor like 1% or 0.1%, how does value of the financial product change? So that is other class of model, that is sensitivity, because there is a lot of mathematics involved there also, right? What numerical procedure you use, finite differencing, central differencing, forward differencing, backward differencing, number of things. And then there is aggregation model. So for example, and to make it concrete, so front as a trader trading in options, he would care about more about pricing and sensitivity, right? That how does sort of price or value of a particular instrument, how does that change if you shock certain things, say interest rate or the underlying stock price, or volatility of the stock price, if those change, how does price or value change? But CEO of the company, he's not interested in so Solomon or Jamie Dimon, they won't care about sort of one particular European option, how the value of that particular product is changing. He would care about, I have so many desks, so many functions within the firm, how they sort of diversify in each other, and what is the total risk that I'm sitting on. So that is one other broad class of models, which is, might have heard about value at risk models or shortfall models or stress models. People can have different type of models. So those are aggregation models. So how much capital they need to hold, in short term, in long term. So these are broad three categories of models that sort of fall, that are used in sort of modeling, at least on the capital market side. And I would sort of take, in terms of defining the model, you can do all of these things in multiple ways, right? And all of them will be model. So in fact, I would sort of redefine what you define model. It is not even an abstract thing, it's a way of thinking about certain phenomena, and your way could be very different from my way. And based on your way, you can have your set of equations and I can have my set of equations. And now, for example, my set of equation is, say, y equal to mx plus c. Now what should be m? So x is an independent variable, and those who come with linear algebra background, it could be a vector, so multiple, uh, basically many variables, but essentially it is what it is. So now you have x, and like you mentioned, you need to estimate independent variables. Where does that estimate come from? It usually will come from historical data. If it comes from historical data, or some phenomena that you have generated assuming some type of distribution, then that gives more confidence to the users of the model than if it's my expert judgment. and you will have one expert judgment, and you can maybe take 10, 20 colleagues, 20 expert judgments, take some average, but it is not backed by data. So data basically forms the backbone of all of financial modeling. And in terms of code, once you have everything, it needs to be automated. Otherwise, there is a lot of operational risk and a lot of inefficiencies different people can have. Looking at different things, it's not very efficient. So it needs to be coded. It could be Excel, Python, R. In fact, the way it works in practice is there will be modelers who'll code something in Python and R. And then they'll give that, once they have identified sort of in y equal to mx plus c example, what should be m, what should be c, that will come from, calibration exercise. So first we have agreed the phenomena follows y equal to mx plus c. And once we have agreed on that, then we fit the data and we come up with the best estimate of m and c that reduces the, error and gives the best explanatory power. So once we have agreed this, then so this is what modeler will give to IT, and then IT will implement probably in C++ or C, whatever is the, core technology that a function or a firm uses. So that's the sort of estimate and code part, and initially I covered data and model part. And data again could come from various sources. One could use Refinitiv, one could use Bloomberg, one could use, Zerodha also provides lots of data, and the data itself could be very different, which can lead to different estimates of M and C. And then again, how do you filter that data? What somebody considers noise may not be considered by noise. So again, all models are wrong, but some are useful, and that usefulness depends on what is the application that you're trying to use. For example, for a trader, probably every small, in the front office models, probably depending upon the size of the book. So for example, for individual traders, like, not even traders, individual are managing uh, our wealth. We don't care about all the input parameters that are there, right? We probably wouldn't care so much about behavioral finance, or we don't collect data from satellites to estimate how much Walmart is selling. But for hedge funds, they care about all that because they are betting heavily with huge amount of capital, so they'll collect that data. So, and they'll have a different model because that there's a different input also. So again, what is the right model or good model, that depends on the use case. There is no model which will explain everything, and there is no model which will not explain, absolutely nothing. Even a sort of bad clock is right 2 times a day.
Yeah.
Thank you,
So that,
Venkat, if you could share your thoughts in terms of how you've applied models in portfolio management, because when we study portfolio management, it's all about there is CAPM. I mean, you'll talk about efficient frontier, something asset allocation.
Yeah.
Where is the modeling aspect comes in portfolio management? Where do people?
Sure, Vishwa. Sure, Vishwa. So I'll try to bring in some insights more from a portfolio management and a wealth management perspective. So depending on, I've spent almost a decade or a little more than a decade in helping clients to build their portfolios or to supply research. And the current role, we help wealth managers and financial planners to help their clients build their wealth. So we use financial modeling across the investment value chain or across the wealth management value chain. So the first and foremost thing, which comes when it comes to wealth management or portfolio management, is to link each of your investments to your financial goals. And when you're doing this, when you're linking these investments to financial goals, it is important that you understand each client uniquely, because it is not one size fits all when it comes to investments, right? You as a portfolio manager or as a wealth manager, you will have to deal with an array of different types of clients. Somebody might be just starting his career. Somebody might be in his mid-30s and just started his family. The risk profile of both these individuals could be completely different. There could be a retiree in your clientele where you want to kind of go low on the risk and try to kind of protect his capital, where the variables could be absolutely different. Or it could be a charitable trust or a charitable organization where risk levels could be just zero. You just can't take any risk, and your entire money has to be preserved and it has to keep giving you annuity. So there are multiple aspects which you will have different unique types of clients you will be managing. Here it is important to understand the unique nature of risk and return expectation of each of these clients. It is also important to understand what are the different types of products available, what are the different types of asset classes available. And when you want to bring in some kind of if you want to link those portfolios to each of these clients to bring it more suitable to each of these clients, it is important to understand what kind of asset allocation is required for each of these clients. And to bring in this efficiency, what we do is we use something called a mean variance optimization, where we look at last 10-15 years of data, what kind of returns each of the asset classes have delivered. So we use, just to give you an idea, we use different representative indices for each of these asset classes. For example, in equity, you have we have a Nifty 500 or a BSE Sensex or Nifty 50. So each of these indices represent different parts or different segments of each of these asset classes. We have gold prices, we have bond yields, we have liquid fund returns, we have cash returns. So we try to integrate everything into a particular model and try to understand for a given level of risk, what is the best possible portfolio you can achieve? What is which portfolio, which of these combinations can give you a highest level of return? Or if you have a set return expectation in mind, which of these portfolios could deliver that by keeping the risk in check? So we use financial modeling to identify those portfolios across the efficient frontier. And of course, so we work with multiple layers of data. So when you go one step further, so now we have done the asset allocation, what kind of products should I choose? And so for that, we use different models to identify given. So if you look at the mutual fund universe, right, there are more than 500 schemes just on the open-ended side. So how many schemes one can invest in, or which of these schemes is best suited? You will end up probably owning about 5 or 6 schemes, or maybe 10 schemes max in your portfolio, right? So how do you select those schemes, right? So you have a lot of research models which will factor in the past returns, the risk, which has, I mean, the different market cycles, how the risk has behaved of each of these schemes in the past, what kind of portfolios these funds are holding, right? So we try to bring in a lot of those data points into the model and try to understand which portfolio kind of best suits a particular client so that he or she can achieve his financial goal.
One of the things I want to understand is that, because Venkat, I'll also let the participants know that feel free to drop your questions. Any questions you have, you can ask any of us. Of course, the slides will be shared. That's the one question we got. Now, talking about, I'll now go probably in the reverse order. See, when I use models largely from the financial forecasting or equity research, right? So our idea is, if it's from a corporate budgeting perspective, what is going to be our cash flows, right? Depending upon what would be our income, what would be our expense, what kind of cash flows we're going to have. Will there be a shortfall in cash? These are the kind of questions that we try to answer. Or you use it in a valuation standpoint. What is going to be company's performance? What kind of cash flows are going to be there? And use it for valuation. So Venkat, because you've also been largely into training, right? You also conducted a lot of training programs, training outside the portfolio management on DCF valuation and everything. Well, how do you think how difficult do you think it is for somebody who is working on equity research valuation to shift to, let's say, building models for portfolio management? Do you think the skill sets are very similar? If they have understanding of portfolio management, they can shift, or do you think it's a completely different domain altogether that requires a different specialization?
So the way I look at it is, Vishwa, so when you're building financial modeling, of course, your fundamentals is mathematics, and it is important to understand the science behind how one variable is related to the other. So that's what we primarily do with the DCF models or when it comes to equity research. So some few tenets which, of course, we keep stressing in our lectures is that be consistent in your approach, be consistent in terms of what kind of variables you're using, be consistent in terms of in terms of your narrative, right? So when you look at the core skills when it comes to to equity research or a financial a DCF valuation, when you want to kind of use a similar kind of a skill set in portfolio management, I think broadly, when you understand the core of how two variables need to be connected, and when you follow some basic hygiene in terms of maintaining these models, I think these skill sets are absolutely fungible. So that's my view. I mean, it's end of the day, it all boils down into mathematics. As long as you're able to connect two numbers, connect two variables, and try to keep the relationship consistent, I think it's the skill set is definitely fungible in my view.
Great. Chetan, what do you think? You talked about three different areas: aggregation models, pricing models, and you talked about different types of models. I'm sure with your experience, you probably have been on all the sides. You can easily attack all the problems. But from a beginner's point of view, do you think all these three have three different skill sets they need to initially spend time on specializing, or like what Venkat suggested? Do you think if they understand the core, they can actually move around all the three?
Right. So I think there is only one thing that all finance professional needs to understand, and that is valuation. Right. That is the basis of all corporate finance decision or personal finance decision. All of that. Right. Because at the end of the day, what do we want to do is increase our own wealth, or company that we work for, increase its own value, it increase its value. So valuation is the fundamental thing that equity analyst or research analyst or risk analyst, or whatever title you call it, that is what they need to understand. And good thing is that is driven by largely two things. Right. One is you need to be able to forecast cash flow, and then second thing is what is the right discount rate to use. And like it sounds simple, but both of them are very, very difficult. Imagine every single day, right? Any security exchange that happens, on any NSE or BSC, somebody has a model who thinks that now is the right time to sell, and somebody else has a view, no, it will go up. We are talking about a security, a bond, or an equity. Two people have different view, and that is why they come together and make an exchange. Somebody, and both parties think they are smart, right? So it is a way about thinking, because they have different way about thinking about the cash flows or the discount rates, right? They have a different view of the future. So these are the two same thing, like two things that broadly one needs to understand. And now from here, it depends on what do you want to achieve, so if it is like small portfolio, maybe, I don't know, let's say somebody for which, for somebody 5,000 is let's say not a big number. He can do very well with a simple model. Don't need to think about whether the distribution of equity is log normal or beta and whatever, right? But so he does not need to care about CAPM or APT or Black-Scholes. He just need to sort of it probably nothing, right? Nothing at all. But if it is about, for example, some from probably Jinal or Venkat are talking about millions of dollars, there you need to have sophisticated model, bring in some law of large numbers type of thinking, that you'll do it over and over again, and be consistent in your approach, right? Be consistent in your approach is just let time apply law of large numbers. That is what it is, because then idiosyncratic noise will walk, sort of it will diversify away. So, I mean, if you sort of understand what is, what a security, cash flows can come from security, then
is if you know the core of the valuation principles, you can apply it everywhere.
Then exactly, and that is driven by largely two things. But one is law of arbitrage, law of no arbitrage, and then other one is that PV of sort of fixed cash flows.
If I may just add to Sashank's point, so I think many times in valuation, especially when you're doing DCF or some of these complicated models, we get too worked up on the models, and we try to focus so deeply on the assumptions. End of the day, we kind of lose the large picture or lose the big picture. So it's always important to keep what are you trying to achieve. It is so we always have to, whenever we get lost, it is always important to come back to the point, the original point, saying that why are we doing this model? What is the end objective? Am I an investment banker trying to convince a buyer or a seller to do the transaction, or am I an investor who is trying to make money, who's trying to invest in the company and make money out of it. So it is always important to understand from, it is always important to revert to the original objective of the model and not getting lost in the financial model. You create multiple complex formulae and complex data points. You focus too much on the assumptions that you lose the larger picture. So that's one common mistake which we tend to do. And of course, it's important that you stay consistent and you have a proper narrative. Your narrative has to speak to your numbers, and your numbers have to narrate your story. So I think it's a two-way street, if I may just add to what Shashank mentioned.
Yeah.
In fact, talking
Probably
about
I'll just
valuations, I see
add-
one question. We'll just take this question, and in fact, probably Jinal could be a best person. So one question we have is, how do you value a startup to provide better answers to VC? Because Jinal, she's probably, she works on actuarial side. She's a chartered accountant, and she's also working on the startup side. So she'll probably be a better person to answer this question. Would you like to take this question, Jinal?
So yes, I would like to take this up, and Shashank and Venkat are actually bang on when they said how you should go about modeling and approach to the model. As far as valuations is concerned, what is the end objective? Like why So I work with a startup incubator in my current role, and we help early startups raise money, get mentorship, get a lot of support. Every day we get this request that I want 5 crore rupees and my dilution should be 10%. I don't know how you work out the other way around, but that is not how it works. So while you might take that as a ballpark number, it's more on negotiation, but your numbers have to speak. At the end of the day, any model, any model that you do, any cash flows that you have to show has to be supported by data. If you are not able to relate your numbers to something which is real, either that has happened in past, or you hook it to someone who has done it, who is doing it, it will be a fantasy, not even a story. And we have really seen great startups not being able to so you are a startup. It is okay if you in your case show losses for 1 year, 2 year, but it is very, very important that you show the story, or you show the journey of how you're going to come out of your red, or how are you going to support your assumptions. How if you want 5 crore, then what use are you going to put to those 5 crore? How is that going to translate into growth? Support that by your numbers, and that will be the bigger story that you are able to sell to your investor. And obviously that has to be supported by something that you have done in past. I mean, I would not really, there are a few very early stage seed stage funding that we have done, but when you want to go to at least angel funding, we would definitely have startup do a lot of homework before they are even face to face with the VCs, because obviously the VCs know what it is like and how they are. And if the startup has done his homework well, only then probably you will be able to support all the assumptions that you have. So it is more, assumptions are definitely there. You're going on the table to sell a story, but once it is there, you will have to support it by a solid validate each of your assumptions basically.
In fact, one of the points that you mentioned, which I have also, sometimes when I've addressed startups, I used to insist is, of course, valuation point, I'll also come to it, what I have suggested in some cases. But one of the things I used to insist is, more than valuation, first try to come up with a story on what you are asking the money for. How are you going to use it?
Correct.
Because I have had cases where somebody prepares a pitch saying that, they need 1 crore, out of that 1 crore, 60 lakhs is salary for the founder and the co-founder team.
Yeah.
Yeah, but that's not going to sell, no matter what valuation you show.
Perfect.
If you're going to ask for money, show them what you're going to do with the money, how the business will grow. For a pure valuation, because if you talk about startups, one of the things I used to tell is, if you think of DCF, then it's all story. Right? I mean, there is literally nothing there as a startup. Everything is story about future. So one of the other things that we could sometimes use is look at operational metrics. So if in certain cases it's possible. So if I'm also starting, let's say, a cab aggregation service like a Ola, and my business is right now not making money, one thing I can do is how many trips people are taking. So I can't do a price to EPS ratio or a DCF, I can't do. But I can look at what is the funds we are engaging. Out of that, how many people are we able to serve? How many trips are we able to serve? And compare it with Ola. Ola probably for whatever valuation they have, they serve, let's say, 1 crore trips a day. And I serve, let's say, 1 lakh trips a day. Then I should be worth at least 1/100th of what Ola is worth. Right? So you could look at metrics like this, enterprise value to some other operational metric. You can look at it. But what I used to advise people is more than the valuation, focus on building a story on what you're going to do with the money. That is more important. If you do well, value can happen. You agree with that, Jinu?
Yes. And more importantly, I think the VCs are interested in giving you money for not trying just new things, for something that you have already tried and you want to build on that. So exactly what you said, they don't want you to obviously, spend their money on marketing or on paying salaries. Customer acquisition is one thing, but how on customer acquisition? If you say 60% is marketing, they are going to really, grill you over how you're going to do, what you're going to do, why this, why that. But if you show them that, we have in past spent this much, because of which now we are at this stage, and this is how my customer acquisition cost has been over the past, which is now I plan to invest this much, and this is how I'm going to. So everything definitely is a story, but supported by it's like
The business growth.
polarizing it. Yeah, like you're just predicting everything for future using this thing.
Okay, great.
I think on this one, Venkat and Shashank could also, that's what you would do even for your, wealth management portfolio, if you're making it up till retirement, or, how have you?
Absolutely. So because when we have worked with different types of clients, there is one section of clients where they have taken up a lot of debt and they just want to know when will they come out of debt, right?
Correct.
So most of these guys could be salaried. So they've taken up a huge housing loan. They might have taken a personal loan in the past, or they might have just piled up credit card debt, for all you know, right? So it's important for them to understand when they will come out of debt. So for that, we need to show them some kind of a visibility in terms of numbers. Every year you are earning this much. You are expecting a salary growth of, let's say, 5% or 10% every year, and this is the level of cash flows which are going out from your salary every month. And it is, and say 5 years from now, your debt will come down by 70% or 80%. I mean, it's very important for you to show them a visibility or a path for at least for a near term, so that there is proper communication between both the wealth manager and the client.
Probably what is important is you will have to tell them that though your salary growth is this much, you will have to save on this much. You could spend only this much, making them, sensitizing them about the term that they will have to save, in spite of earning more. Probably you will have to keep on, this stays aside, like. Yeah.
And some goals might also be unrealistic. So there is also certain situations where financial goals can be unrealistic. So it is important that, so this is where you use modeling and you use Excel and try to show them. So model, end of the day, it will enable you to give you a proper picture to the client, to narrate the story to the client, saying that, boss, your ABC goals are achievable. D and D are maybe not achievable in the near future, but you might have to do certain other things to make it happen. So I think so that's another use case for me.
That question probably we haven't answered it in a while, so I just thought we'll probably take that question. And Ratan, probably you could be the best person to answer that one. In fact, all three of you would be able to, scenario perspective, which is in terms of, how do you consider risk? I remember, Shashank, you touched upon value at risk, right? You
Hmm.
also talked about one of the risk metric, value at risk. So one question here is, how do you consider risk from a probability standpoint? Because variance is just a static risk metric. So from a dynamic risk management, what do you consider as risk? And I'll also add a layer of my question here, because these days I see a lot of increased interest in Monte Carlo simulation or probabilistic models in general, Monte Carlo simulation in specific, within probabilistic models. So Shashank, if you could talk about addressing this question, what kind of risk metrics that you see in addition to variance, what other risks you see, and also how much is these probabilistic models, be it Monte Carlo or be it any other models that we're talking about, uh, how common it is? I mean, how much do you use that in your work? If you
Yes.
could share
So
your
so
thoughts.
there is a myth. Yes. So there is a misconception that variance is sort of how do you measure risk. Variance is a small part, and Venkat will tell you more. What is more important in covariance, and I'll give you an example, and we'll do simple counting, which probably everybody can do. So imagine there are 10 assets in the market, only 10 assets. That's the entire universe. How many variances will you have? You'll have 10, right? One for each. And how many
10.
covariances or correlations do you have? That is 10C2, right?
Yeah.
That is 45. So covariance plays a much bigger part. How the assets are related to each other, that plays a much bigger part. Um, but to the original question, but again, like risk, the way it is measured is largely you look at variance, covariance, and that is how it is measured. In Monte Carlo simulation, also you make some assumption about how what different parts, depending upon whether it's a portfolio or an individual security, how it will evolve. It depends on the measure of variance. But you can look at higher order moments also, um, skewness, kurtosis, and sometimes it depends on the context. But variance and covariance are the more important ones. Covariance even more important. They are difficult to measure also, and because there is, in terms of how many parameters do you need to estimate to have a right measure, so you'll broadly classify into different categories. And it's all probabilistic when you're talking about mean, and once you're talking about mean, variance, standard deviation, then you have entered the realm of probability. And think about it, we are talking about what will happen in future, depending upon what your horizon is, tomorrow, week, month, year. It's all futuristic, and you have to do sort of decision making in some sort of uh, uncertain world, and the only science that is developed to deal with uncertain world is probability. So it's all probability. Even
How
when you
common,
talk about,
how common is Monte Carlo method? Because I see a lot of students, in corporate finance, I tell people don't use Monte Carlo method, because I tell them, you can't even figure out the distribution of the data. Everything keeps changing. I don't even know whether my data is normally distributed or not. Right? Nothing
yeah.
is. So I used to tell people, don't use it in a corporate finance context, at least a corporate budgeting or other things, don't use it. That's what I used to tell. But on a risk management side of things, or generally, you could also talk about from insurance pricing. How much is Monte Carlo or other things taking place? What's the kind of how common is it?
So Monte Carlo is very common, and I'll tell you when one should use, sort of, at least from what I know, when one should use Monte Carlo and one should use other. So there are two forms, and getting bit technical, one is closed form solutions, where you can sort of specify what the equation is for a given phenomena, right, or how different components interact with each other. So if you have that, then that what is going to happen at the end of the day or end of the period. That period could be whatever, 1 year or 1 day, and how the distribution will look like, probability distribution, and then you can use closed form solution, and you don't need Monte Carlo. But when you care about sort of path dependence, that how something evolves, then you need to then you need Monte Carlo simulation. Again, like you can have, if you know what happens at the end of the period, you can use closed form solutions right? And talk about, but in
So
reality,
suppose you are talking about something like a Black-Scholes model, right?
exactly,
Solve
Black-Scholes,
stochastic
exactly.
calculus, come to a final solution. Yes,
Exactly.
Jimmy.
So the way they have their own place because they are computationally very fast. So if you, for example, think about a market maker, he is sitting on a desk, somebody gives him a call, okay, what is the price that you will, depending on, give me bid ask. That person has to answer in real time. And if he starts doing Monte Carlo simulation with 1 million simulations, by that time he has got, bid asks from somebody else, and by that time market also has moved, because in some cases these things can take, you have to run calculations overnight on cloud. But like, this is used heavily, especially in, when you talk about capital calculations, either, economic capital or regulatory capital,
Hmm.
especially when firms come up with their internal view.
Jimmy, how about actually, I mean, insurance pricing? Is it common to use Monte Carlo?
So, so when we want to do it on the portfolio basis, for per policy, maybe we would do it on the normal deterministic model. But when you want to, replicate the per policy for the whole of the portfolio, do sensitivity analysis for profitability, do all the profit margin checks, do your MAD, which is margin for adverse deviation, and all of that time we use Monte Carlo to make sure that we are reasonably in the defined range. What is the stress that we are going to go through, how stretched we are, what is, so when we are running the assumptions, that time, yes.
Venkat, in portfolio management, have you seen people using Monte Carlo? I tried doing it, and actually, I mean, I flirted with a lot of areas, a lot of domains. So I did try it, and then I saw my end users did not understand anything I was talking about. Then I said, I'm leaving it. I'm not spending time on this anymore. But have you tried it, or have you seen
Not
people using
really,
it?
not really, Vishwa. No, personally, I haven't used it.
Okay.
So I think financial models with respect to portfolio management, I think they are a little more simple. But however, having said that, there are now even from a regulatory point of view, it is regulators are making it more. The risk management teams uh, take more responsibility when it comes to asset management. So from that point of view, I think some of these funds, especially the regulated funds, the liquid funds, and some of these sensitive funds, they are mandated to do a regular stress testing on a fortnightly basis. So from that point of view, I think some of these complicated models could come into use, but personally, I haven't used them.
Okay. Okay. Uh, Also, maybe both of you, I could ask Shashank and Jinal also on the corporate finance side. As I told I recommend people, or I keep telling people that don't think of using Monte Carlo in corporate finance. It makes, I mean, because your even mean and standard deviation is unreliable. Accounting standards change. My revenue numbers, the way we accounted in 2 years back is different from how I'm accounting now. So even you can't
Yeah.
rely on mean and standard deviation, then where is the question of generating using Monte Carlo? That's what I tell. But what are your views? Do you agree with it, or do you think no, we can still use Monte Carlo here? Something else? Or what are your thoughts? Jinal, if you could probably answer that.
So you're really right here. In our opinion, especially for the valuations or even corporate finance, when we're going, we know that there are only 2 or 3 decision trees that we're looking at. We are not looking at making it very complex, or thinking of all, like, this is not like the insurance pricing that you're doing, that you will have to run over, say, a 1 crore policies to see how the portfolio will go and all of that. So since that is not happening, we don't make it that complex. Maybe put, and as far as the corporate finance is concerned, lot of it is assumptions. Here in insurance, pricing perspective, at least we have something which is backing the data or the assumptions that we are using. And there is not a lot of changes that you. Also, more importantly, when I will come back to the drawing board and say that what is the end use. when you're putting in so much effort to write a code for a Monte Carlo simulation, what is the end use? How much difference would be there in the final results that you're going to get? Like, is it really worth the effort that you're going to put in to derive that? What are your views, Shashank, on this one?
Don't do much of corporate finance. So I'm not sure in my sort of my portfolio management. I don't do Monte Carlo simulation to predict what would be the price of equity or a index. There I rather than even DCF, I go with multiples because when I sort of we don't know value of lot of things. Absolute value. We look at in terms of relative things. How is it relative to something else? And that's where sort of multiples approach, at least to me, makes sense.
I think a lot of these things, because I remember somebody said Markowitz, despite coming up with this, efficient frontier and all those theories, he apparently used a 1/n portfolio allocation. Take your money, split it equally across all asset classes. He comes up with how do you do asset allocation, asset optimization to rest of the world. His own money, apparently, he just did a 1/n. So we do a lot of things for rest of the world, and when it comes to our own personal work, it's keep it simple.
Yeah.
So there are two questions. Maybe one I'll take, and the other one probably Venkat, or I can, because that's one side. So one question is, I don't know if it's a follow-up to the previous question. Can we reach to reasonable conclusion on valuation using DCF? Because DCF relies largely on, a lot of it comes from terminal value, and there's a lot of subjectivity involved here. Now, yeah, you can also chip in, but my personal view is that when you talk from a DCF perspective, DCF is great in textbooks. DCF is great when you talk to people about modeling skills and everything. But when we talk about valuation, you're absolutely right. Yes, you're absolutely right with your question that it's highly subjective. So a lot of people actually like to keep things simple, like what Shashank mentioned, probably multiples approach is far more easy to convince someone than trying with the DCF. But having said that, for me to use the multiples, there has to be something comparable if I'm a disruptor and where there is no comparable company, then you have to come with DCF. But one of the things is, in DCF, one thing I would like to add is, if it's also, I don't know if it's a follow-up to the question that Shubham had asked about startup. One thing is, while you come up with a DCF and a valuation, lot of times it's not just about valuations. One is negotiation, but if I may add one more component that we need to keep in consideration is transaction structuring. So in startup cases, sometimes what we do is, we just go with, let's say, a compulsory convertible debenture, where we say, that I'm not going to issue a share, I'm going to issue a debenture. The debenture will for sure be converted into shares a few years later. At that time, we'll decide at what price we convert it into shares. So we postpone the valuation decision to future till we get some better idea on the valuations. Sometimes, we also, so DCF can help you, but in reality, DCF, as I said, I'll let others also share their opinion. I'm talking from my personal experience. Many people don't really give too much weightage to DCF because there is too much subjectivity.
Yeah.
I can tell you by changing a small working capital assumption, I've been able to change valuation of share up or down by 20%. Right? Just change your payable days or receivable days a little bit, your valuation jumps up by 20-30%. A lot of people think, it's very subjective to growth rates and beta, terminal growth rate and beta. Forget terminal growth rate and beta. A small decimal level change, which you won't even notice. If you round it up to 0 decimals, you won't even notice there is a change. I could play with the valuation. So I never personally would never run DCF. A lot of people I know, they keep things simple, work with the multiples. If you still have to work with DCF because I'm completely clueless, use your DCF, but you may also need to think from a transaction structuring. How do you give a downside? Maybe go for a convertible bond rather than shares, or add a bit of warrants and right of first exit. A lot of other aspects you can consider. Any thoughts from you?
Also, just to add,
I'm radical. Sorry?
Also, just to add, when you're doing DCF or doing a valuation on an Excel sheet, you try to bring in a lot of rationality. End of the day, market is irrational. I think so the way the way market behaves is completely irrational. I mean, as Sashank rightly said, a transaction happens when one person is selling and the other person is buying. End of the day, both of them think they are right, right? So,
True. Any thoughts, Shashank, on that?
Yeah, I mean, so like it depends on what you have entered into, and again, like it depends whether you're valuing a startup or a large firm, right? For example, a company, um, which one? Let's say ITC, right? So, so when you're talking about DCF, one of the things that you're doing is you're sort of fixing the cash flows, right? But the way financial managers work, or business managers work, it's not like we have taken decision today and then we let future evolve and see, right? There are a lot of decisions, course correction that they can do in future. So lot of valuation, especially in startup, comes with these options to do the course correction, and VCs will take these things into account. And probably I'll go back and cover my example of Amazon that I was trying to. In 1985, different VCs would have covered it, valued it differently. Somebody would have looked at, okay, they are only selling books, and somebody else would have looked at, they would have come up with some DCF model to get an estimate, and they won't come up with sort of one estimate of cash flows. They'll have a range of cash flows that in different scenarios, good economy, bad economy, very good economy, right? What could happen? Somebody would have taken only their books division, and somebody would have said, now they are selling online business, they can sell pretty much anything and they can expand to different geographies. And they would have looked at the valuation of those models, that choices that Amazon can make, and those value of those so-called real options, they would have valued those things much higher than what DCF would give. So it depends again what is somebody's view. I won't say that, it depends on the use case what you're trying to do. But if it's a large corporate like ITC or, Hindustan Lever, then DCF makes sense. They have largely stable cash flow. So, a lot of equity research, if you sort of go broker research, they look at, okay, what is the, probably if you just look at, a lot of analysis that you see even on Nifty, what is the earning 1 year down the line, and then what is your growth rate assumption. So I won't totally discount it. Many people are using it. So everybody is wrong. Imagine everybody is wrong, but everybody is wrong in a same way.
Yeah.
Then the sort of consensus will be this: no matter what, you may be right, and future will take time. Word will sort of take time to realize that you were right, but by that time, there may be a deep hole in your pocket. So if
By that time, we all
consensus
might be
is
dead.
this, then exactly. So
Hmm.
use both, and then sort of, if you have, I would say, if you have 10 tools in your arsenal, then use all 10 and see which one makes most sense.
The next question we have is, this is again one of the area I wanted to touch. See, in corporate finance, I said, even averages are not very reliable. So that is the kind of situation we have. So we don't really use, or at least in most of my models, there's a lot of qualitative judgment coming into picture, not much of quantitative items. So one of the questions I have here is, how much do you use measures like GARCH for measuring risk? Do you use GARCH models for measuring risk, or is these are just used in paper? Because today, of course, you also have concepts like implied volatility to get the volatility rather than just relying on GARCH. Uh, so, who would like to take that question? I mean, Jinal, Shashank, you've used these things like GARCH or other models.
Short answer is yes. So again, like I'll re-quote what I quoted earlier: all models are wrong, some are useful. So I mean, take that thing seriously, that all models are wrong. So there are different ways to model volatility. There is implied volatility that Vishwa just mentioned. Then there is, you can do simple historical average, right? You can use models like GARCH or exponential weighted moving average, and see, look at the range of values that they can provide, right? And what they are doing. So for example, if you take historical average
Yeah.
volatility, right, then you need to think about what is the question that it is answering. So if you just look at the historical average, then it is saying that future volatility cannot be beyond what we have seen in the history, and that is one of the limitations, and that is what you have to see when you talk about exponential weighted or implied. When you look at sort of implied volatility from options, then it is what market thinks the future volatility will be like, what is the range of values of stock prices will be. So the short answer is that these things are used, that is why they are there. And like one of the use cases is also, is used in teaching. Right. But it's not like, if you haven't seen something, it does not mean it's useless. It has its place, right? There are so many people who decide CFA FRM curriculum and they have put it there, which means it is used. Somebody makes decisions using these things, and now those decisions sometimes can be wrong. So uh, once I was reading a book, on economics, and it was saying like there are different views in economies. Some believe sort of one end of the spectrum, and some believe some other end of the spectrum. And now which one is right? The answer is like these different views are right in different points of time and different type of scenarios. So, like I said, if you have 10 tools in your arsenal, use all 10, but know when to use which one.
So the answer is yes, portfolio managers, when you're looking at risk, you should be looking at something like a GARCH. That's the answer from Shashank. But all these tools, not just, not that one is superior than the other, but you should try to use all of them and know when to use them. Jinal, what about you? How much quantitative techniques that, in actuarial science, how much of that you should be knowing?
Not really a lot of quantitative techniques as such, but yes, a lot of logic that goes. So actual science is a very technical paper, and we would have done a lot of technical, as Shashank just mentioned that CFA, CPAs, they teach one of the use cases teaching them, so we learn a lot of things, and a lot of it is put into practice in a certain way. So I remember, when my boss was telling, you didn't do the Markov chain, you don't understand this is how this will, progress. So this is how there will be a dependency. So yes, but obviously in the real life, since the models are made very differently than what we do in theory, in my, that's how it has always been for me. Fundamentally knowing it, what is the use case, how it is very important. And then in the, when you are actually using it, putting it to practice comes in a very different way. And then probably most of the times, we always check it from the first principles, that does this look right for us? And
Intuition, how does it look intuitive?
no, intuition, for first principles say, if you do 1 plus I raised to n, again you will check that, even after say 50% this risk and this risk, do you think this much is at least a ballpark figure that the company will have to pay as a benefit? Does it look reasonable at the end of the day?
So
Intuition formulas of the first principles, I would say. Take a pen, paper, and check whether it looks good for you.
So one thing, I get is, no matter how quantitative your model gets, you still cannot completely remove the human judgment aspect of it. So whether, like, even if you're talking about volatility, which one should I use? That each one tells me a different story. Which one should I use? Somewhere a human judgment comes into picture. Can I say that even for quantitative models, is that right? If I say something like that, that human judgment will be somewhere, maybe in a complete other extreme. When you go to a machine learning models, probably you get rid of the human judgment. Probably there, I'm not sure. I only know machine learning to the extent I can talk on that for 2 minutes. Nothing beyond that. In a meeting, if I meet someone, I should be able to say something on machine learning. That's all I know. Nothing beyond that. But barring these maybe artificial intelligence and other things, even quantitative models somewhere require some human judgment. Is that right?
Yes, I would really believe
At
so.
least this judgment. At least this judgment, which of the qualitative model that you should use, whether you would go with Monte Carlo or Black-Scholes, right?
Yeah.
That's the, like, humans are making decision even with machine learning models. There are so many now. Simple classification problem, whether that will be bad or not, right? Now there are so many models to classify things. Which one would you use?
Sure.
So when it's in portfolio, I'm assuming, it's going to be a lot of, when you talk about mean variance optimization and all, you will probably use a lot of quants in any case there.
Yeah. So there is extensive use of quantitative, especially to understand how investments have behaved in the past. So it's important to understand large. So law of large numbers states that there is a very high probability of reverting to mean, right? So you try to understand how investments or different asset classes have behaved in the past. So for that, maybe not. I mean, maybe just variance or covariance might not do full justice. Maybe you will have to use few more measures as well, like something like a kurtosis, something like a skewness, something to understand how maybe Sharpe ratio or trainer or beta, just to understand how those investments have performed in different time frames, different market cycles, with relative to different indices, how they have performed. For a given level of risk, has the fund manager able to, has the investment delivered has the investment delivered a superior return when compared to the risk underlying. So to understand some of these aspects, I think we extensively use quantitative techniques.
Actually, we've significantly exceeded our time, but I still thought, I'll check, maybe especially for the benefit of a lot of people, they must also be looking at from a career perspective as well. So maybe at least a couple of areas I wanted to touch upon is, I'll come to corporate finance modeling, what kind of, when somebody's testing, what kind of skill sets you look for. But generally, if you could talk about, in actuarial science, when somebody is looking at, let's say, modeling skills, what do they primarily look for? Is it about your knowledge of Excel or R, Python kind of a thing? Or is it about, because I remember going through the modeling book in actuarial science, when I went through it, it doesn't talk about how do you model a particular, let's say, insurance premium or anything. It talks about a process. How do you factor in a Markov jump? How do you model a jump diffusion?
Correct.
So it's more on that aspect. If you could just touch upon that for a minute, thank you.
In all,
Sorry for making you stay
in
late.
all the jobs that I've done, whether I've been working with whatever teams, however, it's very, very important that the person understand the fundamentals, like the basic of how it is going to make impact on the scheme of things. That is very, very important, and that is what makes a difference. The key thing is that not passing papers. Obviously now the insurance companies would want more passes on your papers, would want a little experience, would want you to know things. But when I was modeling and I don't understand a particular thing, I would just go to a Google, type how do you do this, and there'll be 10 things to help you out. But something that Google will not be able to tell you is how do you put the logic to it, like how and that is what is taught as a core technique in our subject, and that is something that we should know and we should carry as.
Thank you, General. Sorry, I know you have to leave. Thank you very much for joining us.
Perfect.
Thank you. So, Shashank, when you look at somebody joining your risk management team, what do you expect? And in terms of the software, also, how critical it is to know something like, from a software aspect as well as mathematics, what is the first key thing that you look for them?
So it again depends on the role that we are hiring for, but probably, I'll answer that if you're looking for a quantitative risk analyst. So there are two things that are must, and like there will be a degree. So if you're at a junior level, for example, we hire, let's say, straight out of college, then I wouldn't put so much emphasis on whether person knows financial products or not. But mathematics is no matter which financial product we are giving, for whatever reason, then he needs to understand the underlying mathematics. So that is something that I'll put emphasis on. And then communication skills are very important. You have to, whatever you do, you have to present it, you have to own it, share it. So that becomes important. And there is a lot of these days there are so many things on R and Python and whatnot, but I think Excel is still has a very special place, and everybody sort of should know Excel. And if you haven't invested in time, then first invest in Excel and then probably R Python type of things. So that would be my advice.
Knowledge of R and Python when it comes to, let's say, getting a job in a quantitative modeling, is it a deal breaker?
It depends. It depends. Like for example, in my role, we look at models that somebody else has developed. So we would want person to be able to read code at least somebody else has written, and we wouldn't know whether it's C++, R, and Python. But a lot of programming languages, they have some common concepts for loop, while loop, conditionals, if else, variable, assignment, and you import different modules and you get a gist of things at least. So that is important. But in some other firms, for example, if you apply for a hedge fund who are basically very small quantitative algorithmic trading they are doing, then for them it will be a deal breaker. So it depends what you're doing, but these things are gaining importance as we speak. So if you have time, then do invest in learning R or Python. Like pick anyone, whatever you like. And then if you have a mathematical statistical background, then I would say maybe pick up R. That may feel more natural. But if you come from a programming background, then probably pick Python, and that may make you feel more natural. So
thank you, Shashank. And Venkat, what are your thoughts in terms of if someone wants to get into portfolio management, let's say, what are the skill sets when you're looking at them? What kind of skill sets do you think they should have to be able to make a career in it?
Sure. In my view, I think irrespective of what you do in the value chain of portfolio management or wealth management, end of the day you're an analyst. You always have to think like an analyst when you communicate with clients. Clients expect you to bring in some expertise, insights, and again, so you always behave like an analyst. So I think from an analytical point of view, you have a lot of data which keeps coming in on a real-time basis, and also you have multiple options today when it comes to investing for either for clients or suggesting investments for clients. I think from that perspective, it is important to understand how investments behave, how investments have behaved in the past, and what are the different ways in which investments could behave in the future when it comes to putting in assumptions, putting in various unique factors of clients. So from that point of view, I think I look at it. I look at things more like an analyst, irrespective of whether I'm doing sales or whether I'm shortlisting products or when I'm doing stress testing for my portfolios. So I think from that point of view, Excel is extremely important. And
okay, so I think all said and done, Excel is at least the starting point, I think.
Absolutely.
So yeah, I think we have almost come to the end. Any questions from the participants? We'll be happy to take. So then I think because we are pretty much way behind schedule. I think we've 3 to 4, but I think it was a very engaging discussion. I should say, I myself gained a lot of interesting knowledge speaking to people from different areas. One of the question I've got here is, can freshers make a career in portfolio management and investment banking? What skill set and characters are required? I'll probably throw some of my ideas here, and probably I'll also ask others to chip in. See, when it comes to portfolio management, perhaps I'm not the best guy to answer. If you talk about investment banking, yes, freshers can make. Everybody starts as a fresher, right? I mean, everybody starts as a fresher. You can join. One of the things that people look for when you talk from an investment banking perspective. So what we understand of investment banking itself is slightly different. For when I started, initially wanted to get into investment banking, I thought investment banking is about. I had a confusion that investment banking I thought was ANC, asset management. I thought it's about investing in stocks. But investment banking is about helping companies raise money through debt or equity, or helping them with mergers and acquisitions, kind of a thing. There are many roles here. Front-end roles where you are client-facing and you are the one who is kind of doing the deals and everything. And there are back-end roles, right? Back-end roles where you are probably taking care of risk management. You are trying to decide the set of policy, what is allowed, what is not allowed, or monitoring whether the team is working in terms of a policy. if you're thinking from a front-end role perspective, yes, freshers, everybody starts as a fresher. What character they look for, in fact, more than skill set, character is what they look for the most, which is hard work. You must be willing to put that hard work whenever it's required, and you should be a good learner. Lot of investment bankers, in fact, I know a lot of them, they start out sometimes absolutely at zero when it comes to finance. They start absolutely zero. They start making PowerPoint presentations after presentations, copying things from website, put it in a neatly formatted, put it, but then they work hard and they learn. And that is one thing that they definitely look for in investment banker. Good communication skills, Excel skills definitely matters. Good presentation, PPT skills, and above all, hard work. Knowledge of finance is definitely in Indian context, at least knowledge of finance would be, they would expect you to at least be able to read a financial statement and calculate some ratios. I know, some of my colleagues who have, not colleagues, I mean some counterparts who have started history, they studied history and then got into investment banking, in UK or US. But they made it big because they were all good at, the hard work and learning. That always was there. In India, I would assume that, people would still expect you to have some basic knowledge of at least financial statements and ratio analysis, Excel PPT skills. I think it's almost prerequisite, I would say. Anyone, any thoughts? If you'd like to add, what would people need to make a career here as a staff fresher, if you want to start? Venkat, you have some thoughts?
Covered it.
As well as portfolio management side?
So, portfolio management, yeah, I think, as you rightly said, Excel and PPT are like prerequisite, but it is important that, I mean, everybody started out as a fresher. So, portfolio management itself is, if you look at it, it's a huge ocean. What type of portfolio management you want to do? Whether you want to do portfolio management more from as from a wealth management point of view, where you manage different investments of clients, which could be mutual funds, which could be cash, which could be bonds, which could be fixed income, which could be alternative assets, where you are not directly managing each of these investments, but you are managing investment products for clients. Right, so that is one area of portfolio management where here it is important that you understand asset classes, you understand investment products, different risks, and different return expectations. How do you marry those with the client's objectives? So this is one vertical of portfolio management, if I were to put it. The other one is more into buy side, where you are a fund manager, where you are into asset management, where you pull money from clients, you manage money for clients, where you buy stocks directly. Where you buy and sell bonds and stocks directly. Here, I think this is a different. It's a slightly harder nut to crack, if I were to put it. Where especially in the buy side, if you look at in India, there are about 44 asset management companies, mutual fund companies, and maybe about 200, 300 portfolio managers. Here, if you look at it, maybe again the starting point could be somewhere as an analyst, where you understand stocks, where how well are you able to influence fund managers into buying your ideas. So that's where you generally start from, and gradually you progress from being an analyst to being a portfolio manager. Typically, this journey could take somewhere around 10 to 15 years, if I were to kind of put it. Managing investment vehicles, managing client individual personal finance portfolios, I think it's a little bit easier if purely from a career point of view. Where I mean the number of wealth managers in India are there are enough wealth managers, and you keep getting opportunities to start your career here as well. So I think those are maybe two different verticals of portfolio management, if I were to put it.
Sure, your thoughts?
I think both of you covered pretty much everything. I would say, right, diligence is important. When you're fresher, there are no high expectations, but what is expected is that you'll work diligently. You have good communication skills. You have to deal with senior people. So those are the two things that I put a lot of. How do I assess it, like whether somebody is diligent or not? So if you're a fresher, I would look at your grade sheet and see how well you can explain things that you have written in your resume, and whether you have done well in our courses. So one of the my mentors once mentioned, anybody can do things that do things well that they like, right? And the real challenge is in doing things that you don't like. That's where character shows. And so there are some people say who I failed, or I did not do well in that particular course because I was not enjoying it. And life will throw so many things at you that you won't enjoy, and you still have to sort of do them well and persevere. So this is something that, for example, you want to do M&A on, let's say, technology, and client comes, he says, no, I have healthcare business. You still have to do it, right? So it's not like I don't like it, so I won't do it. So that is very important. If you have that attitude, then you learn pretty much everything. Then what you like and don't like, that also, once you have spent enough time, then you get to know really whether you like something or not. Like if somebody made an opinion in a course that they did not like, you know during a course of 4 months that they did not like, then probably they did not sort of
In fact,
show
one of the
enough
thing I
character
always
there.
one of the thing I always tell people is, if you're a fresher, obviously be prepared to do boring tasks because your seniors don't want to do the boring task, and somebody has to do it. And as a fresher, you are going to be the person on whom all the boring tasks will be thrown off. So you will have to be prepared to do that, and do that with diligence. Do that with diligence. Make sure that do it correctly. That is something that definitely anybody would expect. I know it's also getting late for Shashank also. So I think we'll end it here. It was, as I was saying earlier, I actually got to know a lot of things. I thought I'll do this panel discussion to help participants learn a lot of new things. But I should say, as despite being somebody who's been in financial modeling for such a long time, it was very useful. Getting people from different backgrounds sharing their thoughts. Thank you, Shashank. Thank you, Venkat. Thank you, Jinal. Thank you very much. Any final remarks you would like to say as we end? Jinal, maybe we'll start with you. Again, we'll go in ascending order and probably we'll just close it.
No final remarks. I think modeling, just know your fundamentals well, know what you're doing well, and modeling is tools, and probably people will figure out. I think that's what I think.
Thank you, Jinal. Shashank,
I mean, like, final word would be like all the best to whatever you want to do. And if you need any help, I'm available on LinkedIn. You can reach out to me. Like,
yes, you can search for Shashank Malhotra. Jinal is Jinal Shah. You can just check for their names. I'm sure they'll throw up. There might not be, too many people with very similar names. So, and with similar qualification, chartered accountant and actuary, Jinal and Shashank from IIT. Venkat, I think if you put Venkat Ram with the H at the end, you won't find anyone else. There's only one Venkat Ram with the H at the end. Right. So you'll definitely find that. Yeah, Venkat, anything you would like to say?
So, if you're fresher, I think don't worry too much. I think if you want to get into finance, I think Shashank and I are examples in terms of how non-finance people can actually get into finance. So when I started, at least I didn't know what is asset, what is liability, but I think eventually you'll get there. So stay focused. Keep the end objective in mind in terms of what you want to do. I think rest of the things will fall into place. So.
yeah, probably I can just sort of share an anecdote. At some point of time, somebody asked me what is the difference between asset and liability earlier in my career, and I was like, if my investment is going up, it is an asset that's going down. It's a liability. So if I have done well, you can do well too.
Thank you very much. And thanks for your time. Thank you. Bye bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you, Vishwa, for having us. Thank you.
Thank you, Vishwa.
It's my pleasure. Thank you.